Well, I'll be honest. I think we have to let people know that this is not about photo ID. It's not about photo ID. It's about remaking our election system to fence people out, to put up barriers, and it's really about ending same-day voter registration.
How about rigging elections?
Well, that's one way to put it.
We're lucky to have with us Representative Steve Simon. Steve represents Hopkins and half of St. Louis Park. He's running for a 5th term in House District 46B. Steve, you are one of the more articulate individuals over in the State House of Representatives. We've already spoken on prior programs about your position on the marriage amendment. You've gained a lot of fame within the state and across the country for your ability to get to the root of that situation. But I want to talk about the photo ID bill, and I guess we should call it the state photo ID bill. What's your position with respect to that amendment?
Well, I oppose it. I oppose it for a number of reasons. First of all, nobody, I think, would argue that we want people, only eligible voters, to vote. I think we all agree on that. So when it comes to voter verification and making sure we verify that everyone who votes is entitled to vote, that's a no-brainer. That's 100% in any opinion poll, or it should be. The question is, do we want the state to do what this constitutional amendment would do? And here are some little-known facts, little known because the authors seem not to want people to know about this particular amendment. First, it requires a government-issued photo ID.
What's that?
Well, good question. I raised the question on the floor of the House. I picked up and showed my House of Representatives ID badge.
That can't work, can it?
Well, it's a photo ID and it's issued by the state. So I have no idea whether that would make me eligible in terms of showing up at a polling place. But here's another interesting distinction about this government issued. If you're a student at Mankato State, for example, presumably a photo ID from your school would work. But if you're a student at Carleton or Hamlin or St. Olaf, you're out because it's not a government-issued photo ID. So that's another thing. The other thing is that for the first time in state history on a mass basis, we're going to have something called a provisional ballot, which means you might show up to a polling place, and depending on whether someone challenges your identity or says you don't look like your photo or any number of reasons, you can vote all right, but your ballot will then go into the maybe pile. Maybe we'll count it, maybe we won't. And you have to then go back to your county auditor within, say, 7 days, at least that's the ideas of the framers of this law, and you've got to prove you are who you say you are. Now, for those of us in Hennepin County, it's somewhat of a pain. You go to downtown Minneapolis, pay the exorbitant parking rates, go into the government center, and figure that out. But if you're in greater Minnesota, your county auditor could be over 100 miles away, and you'll have to take off work and you'll have to go and prove who you say you are because someone strategically, and for maybe not the most savory reasons, challenged you, claimed that you don't look like you look in the driver's license or other photos, so that's another reason. Overall, I think this is putting too many barriers in place that are simply not necessary. You know, the proponents of this like to point to examples of voter fraud, but in 2008, a study was conducted after that election, and there were 38 examples, and only 38 where county attorneys pursued claims against people who had voted illegally. 100% of those claims, all 38, were people who had either voted or registered illegally for one reason, and that is that they were felons. And guess what? A photo ID provision won't solve that problem because felons have driver's licenses and photo IDs too. So this doesn't even solve the problem, which comprises 100% of the cases from 2008, which is felons voting when they shouldn't vote.
So you've pointed out the hardship that an individual will go through under some circumstances.
Right.
But there's another side of that story too, and I think Joe Mansky, the fellow that heads up elections over in Ramsey County, pointed out, he estimates, as I understand it, that it's going to cost the county of Ramsey $1.7 million, and cities within Ramsey County another $200,000 or $300,000, and some of those costs, perhaps most of those costs, are going to be recurring, so that it's not only to put this system in place, but every time there's an election you're going to have that. What are people thinking about, and who's going to pay for that?
That's a great question, and it's an unanswered question. It's very costly.
An unfunded mandate?
Basically, yes. I'll tell you, there are other lesser, less intrusive, and more accurate ways to ensure compliance with the law. Let me give you an example that our Secretary of State, Mark Ritchie, floated, which I think is a great idea. We have the technology right now in place, this is not science fiction, to do electronic poll books which have been experimented with by Minnetonka, to name others in our area, where you can go in and without imposing some sort of burden on the 89-year-old, for example, who may be in a nursing home, the photo is already preloaded. So if you have an ID, if you have a photo ID of any kind, a state ID, or if you have a college ID.
It's there when they show up at the polls.
It's there when they show up. So you don't have to, if you get mugged on the way to the polls, or you forgot it, or you lost it, you're not penalized by having your right to vote taken away. And yet, there is verification there. Now, left unanswered there is the question of what about all the folks who don't have an ID? And let me just tell you, by way of an anecdote, and it is only an anecdote, I went to a senior high-rise recently, along with a legislative colleague in my district in St. Louis Park, and I just did an informal poll among the few dozen people who were there. I said, how many of you folks have a valid photo ID that lists your current address, not a former address?
Right.
Only half raised their hand. And that's the key thing, Tim, is you hear often the analogy. People say, and it's deceptively simple, it's sort of seductive. People will say, well, come on, every day you have to show an ID to buy a beer or board an airplane. But the difference there is that the clerk at the liquor store or the TSA agent doesn't care whether your ID lists your current address. In fact, they don't even care if it's a Minnesota ID. If you're buying a beer or boarding an airplane at the MSP airport, they want to see that it looks like you and that it is you. They don't care whether it's an Oklahoma driver's license or Indiana or California or anything else, but they will here.
Now, I know a lot of this has got to get sorted out by the courts, which of course is another expense that someone's going to bear. But is it true that the military ID is not acceptable for purposes of voting?
Well, it's unclear. And one of the problems with this amendment is how unclear it is.
What about a passport?
Don't know.
Are there any known exceptions to this?
Well, the sponsor of the bill in the House, Representative Mary Kiffmeyer, who is the former Republican Secretary of State, was frustratingly vague on all of these points, and that's why they're fair questions for you and others to ask. In fact, one other big question is how much discretion, how much wiggle room will the legislature have if this passes and we come back into session in 2013? Will the legislature have the ability to shape this and kind of write up kind of the details?
Kiffmeyer
or
says
not?
it's self-executing.
Yeah, she does, and I think she's totally wrong about that.
But now, getting down to the nitty-gritty, Steve, I mean, isn't it a fact that this is just 100% a partisan issue on the part of Republicans across the country to suppress Democratic votes?
It's not a mere coincidence that in most places where this has been passed, whether it's Indiana or Minnesota or any other state, it has been almost completely 100% partisans, with Republicans saying yes and Democrats saying no. And let me just add, for the benefit of your viewers, there are several states that have done this, that's no secret. Minnesota will join only one other state, if this passes, in going the extra step of not just passing the law, but putting it in the state constitution beyond the reach of future legislatures. You know what that one state is? Mississippi. Only one state, Mississippi, has gone so far as to put it in the state constitution, where it is above the heads of us all and imposing our will on future generations that way. Every other state, and all the Republicans and conservatives in states as varied as Iowa and Kansas and Wisconsin, have had the self-restraint and the self-discipline to at least say, we're not going to mess with our founding document. We're not going to put it over the heads and beyond the reach of the current generation or legislatures. Even they, in those other states, have said, we're going to put it in statute where it can be amended and tweaked and changed and improved if need be. Not Minnesota. Not Minnesota. The Republican leadership here has decided, totally ditching any self-restraint or self-discipline, that it's not enough to pass a law. No, they want to put it in our founding document, which only one other state, Mississippi, has done. That, to me, I think, is a real shame.
Steve, I vote absentee more often than not. Am I going to be able to vote absentee if this amendment passes?
I think that is an open question. I think.
What about same-day registration?
Same-day registration, as we know it, will essentially be over, is my prediction. And many experts have predicted that as well. I think same-day. I think an argument could be made that same-day registration would basically be unconstitutional under the language of this amendment, and that's a real shame because many states around the country, regardless of party, people are trying to follow Minnesota when it comes to same-day registration because of the great boost in turnout and civic engagement. They're not trying to shed that; they're trying to follow it. They're trying to emulate us, and here we are doing something which, if it passes, will potentially do great harm and possibly eliminate same-day registration.
So we have former Vice President, Democrat Walter Mondale,
Right.
former Republican Governor Arnie Carlson, heading up a movement to attempt to defeat this constitutional amendment. We have the League of Women Voters
Right.
weighing in, and of course they're being disparaged now by the Republicans as being some sort of agenda-driven organization.
Right.
Good luck with that argument. But what can we as ordinary citizens do to work to see this amendment defeated?
Well, I'll be honest. I think we have to let people know that this is not about photo ID. It's not about photo ID. It's about remaking our election system to put up, to fence people out, to put up barriers, and it's really about ending same-day voter registration.
How about rigging elections?
Well, that's one way to put it. It certainly would put the vote out of the reach of a lot of law-abiding, long-time voters. There are people out there who have voted for Roosevelt, people who are into their 80s and 90s, but who were in assisted living facilities or nursing homes. We have veterans, we have others who quite realistically will not be able to vote if this provision passes. And that's a shame, and it's an extra added shame that it will have been added to our Constitution, where it's beyond our reach to change, amend, make better, improve. We won't be able to do that, practically speaking, because it'll be in the Constitution if it passes, not as a regular old law, which every state but Mississippi has been happy to do. So unfortunately, we're seeing, I mean, this is radical stuff. This isn't, I'm talking about putting it in the Constitution. That is a real radical attempt here to make a change.
Steve, you've got a platform. You can step up and speak as a elected representative, and I hope you do so, because I think people that hear your message will be guided accordingly. Thanks so much for stopping by.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Democratic Visions is handmade by volunteers through DFL Senate District 48, Eden Prairie and Minnetonka. Lori Pryor, Chair.